afternoon, everybody. It is an honor to introduce this afternoon's keynote speaker. Professor Dana Alicia Thompson is a clinical professor of law at the University of Michigan Law School and is the founding director of the Transactional Law Clinics program and the University of Michigan's Law School's Entrepreneurship Clinic, where she represents University of Michigan student-led and community-based startup ventures. They represent clients in corporate entrepreneurship, social entrepreneurship, and nonprofit law matters. It is the first of its kind in the United States, and the clinic has provided no-cost legal services to a significant number of student-led and other startups. They offer an array of services and resources to help innovators launch and grow their businesses. The clinic also provides law students with real-life experience needed to help early-stage companies after the students graduate from law school. Prior to the clinic, Professor Thompson taught in the law school's Urban Communities Clinic, where she represented small businesses, startup ventures, social enterprises, and community-based organizations, primarily based in Detroit. Before joining Michigan Law, Professor Thompson taught at Wayne State University Law School and founded and directed Wayne Law's Small Business Enterprises and Nonprofit Corporations Clinic. At Wayne Law, she was also the director of the Damon J. Keith Law Collection of African American Legal History. She's also a contributing editor to Building Healthy Communities, a guide to community economic development for advocates, lawyers, and policymakers, and the author of the article L3Cs, an innovative choice for urban entrepreneurship and urban revitalization, which explores the role that low-profit, limited liability companies, also known as L3Cs, can play in establishing viable, minority-owned urban small businesses. She also has an article called Accelerating the Growth of the Next Generation of Innovators, which discusses the importance of campus incubators collaborating with law school clinics. Professor Thompson also sits on the Bryn Mawr College Presidential Advisory Council. She is the immediate past chair of the Community Economic Development Committee of the American Bar Association's Business Law Section, and is past co-chair of the Legal Educators Committee of the American Bar Association's Forum on Affordable Housing and Community Development Law. She's also the immediate past co-chair of the Association of American Law Schools Clinical Law Section's Awards Committee. And in addition, she served on former Michigan Governor Jennifer Granholm's Emerging Small Business Leaders and Entrepreneurial Council. So we are in for a treat this afternoon. Please join me in welcoming Professor Dana Thompson. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Fenaba. I appreciate it, and it's wonderful to be here. Good afternoon, everyone. So it's a pleasure to be here at this conference. A lot of the work that I do is representing disenfranchised small businesses, and primarily owned by women and people of color, and many in Detroit. So it's such a pleasure and an honor to be here today. So I'd like to begin my talk with a true story about an African-American women-owned business in Detroit. So there are two African-American sisters from Detroit, one a lawyer and one a professor, and they loved popcorn. And they mastered recipes for numerous flavors of popcorn. They initially started to make the popcorn for just their family, and then eventually for their friends. And when their friends tasted the popcorn, they loved it so much that they encouraged them to start selling the popcorn. So the sisters agreed that they would start to make this popcorn, even though they had full-time professional careers. They said, why not? We can make some extra money for our family. And they began making it out of their homes. They sold it at farmers markets and local festivals and street fairs. And everyone who purchased it loved it. They loved it so much that the sisters thought, we can really make this a profitable business that we could, own a retail store. So they ended up opening up a bricks and mortar store in a bustling, well-traveled location in downtown Detroit. And when they first opened the store, they were working at the store before work, after work. They had their full-time jobs, but, as small business owners, you have to spend a lot of time and energy getting your business off the ground. So they continued to sell the popcorn in their store, at farmers markets, fairs, festivals, and to other individuals and organizations who purchase the popcorn for special events, so for weddings and other types of events. And given the volume of the business, the sisters realized that they needed to hire additional workers. And these workers were all from Detroit, and some of them had childcare challenges and other challenges at home. And the sisters wanted to hire these workers not only because they needed the assistance in their store, but because they also wanted to provide good employment opportunities for people from Detroit. So they worked with them, and sometimes the workers had difficulties making it to the business because of the challenges, but the sisters understood that and worked with them. So they financed the business with their personal savings and earnings from jobs. They really were reluctant to get loans or other types of investment, even though the sister who was a lawyer had a lot of community connections, and the sister who was a professor did as well. And although business sales were strong, the sisters didn't have strong financial management skills, and eventually their expenses began to exceed their sales. So after a few years in business, eventually the sisters had to close the popcorn shop due to a lack of capital and high expenses. And I was distraught when they had to close their business because they made the best popcorn. It was amazing. But this story, it's unfortunately too common among small businesses owned by women and people of color. So although the United States has an enviable entrepreneurial culture and a track record of building new companies, new and small business owners, like the women who own the popcorn shop, often face particular challenges, including lack of access to capital, insufficient business networks for peer support, investment and business opportunities, and the absence of the full range of essential skills necessary to lead a viable business, to survive and to grow. And of course, women and entrepreneurs of color often face even greater obstacles. While business formation is, of course, primarily a matter for the private sector, public policy can and should encourage increased rates of entrepreneurship and the capital, networks, and skills essential for success, especially among women and people of color. So today, I'm going to focus my talk on the importance of small businesses in the United States economy, the critical barriers that entrepreneurs face, especially women and people of color entrepreneurs, and how the right programs and policies can help fill the funding gap to help small businesses reach their full potential. So it's well known that small businesses play an important role in the development and growth of the U.S. economy. And this slide shows the number of net new jobs that small businesses create. For example, in 2014, there were 29.6 million small businesses in the United States, which employed 56.8 million Americans. To put this number into context, these 56.8 million employed Americans represent roughly 40% of the total employment of that year. In fact, a 2016 report commissioned by J.P. Morgan Chase and Company that studied economic development in the United States concluded that, quote, a modest increase in the number of jobs created by existing small businesses, 1 to 3 jobs per business, could create enough employment opportunities for all currently unemployed inner-city businesses. Overall, small businesses are the drivers of the U.S. economy, responsible for creating 2/3 of net new jobs in the past 25 years. So creating successful small businesses is crucial. Looking forward, and this is not an easy slide to read, but I'll just explain it. Looking forward, potential employer businesses, and in particular, early stage potential employer businesses, are more likely to be owned by someone younger than 46 or from a racial or ethnic minority group. Small business owners tend to hire people within their social network and their communities. And small businesses in urban areas owned by people of color tend to hire people of color in the urban areas in which they're located. Therefore, we have to ensure that we have the right policies in place and provide the right tools to help entrepreneurs and small business owners, especially those owned by people of color, successfully confront the many challenges that they face. The first challenge that small businesses face is a likelihood of failure. About 20% of new businesses fail in their first year, and about 50% by their 5th year. And you know, it's complex to determine what causes business failure, but some of the leading causes are thought to include inadequate access to monetary and human capital, particularly skills and knowledge related to financial literacy. So think back to the first example that I provided of the sisters with the popcorn shop. A survey from the Federal Reserve found that small business employer firms cite lack of credit availability or inability to secure funds for expansion as the top financial challenges they face. Some research suggests that inadequate access to financial and human capital, including skills related to financial capability, are leading causes of small business failure. But despite the high risks of business failure, successful entrepreneurship is correlated with wealth, savings, job satisfaction, and economic mobility. For example, the survey of consumer finances shows that for households in the bottom half of wealth distribution, the average value of business equity was only $20,000, but that represented 60% of those households' net worth. So let's talk about the second challenge for small businesses, access to capital. The 3 main sources of capital for small businesses are personal and family savings, and that consists of about 64% of all employer businesses. They use personal and family savings. Business loans from banks are about 18% of employer businesses. That's how they that's the capital that they use for their businesses. And personal credit cards, which is about 10.3%. And the reason why a large share of these businesses rely on personal and family savings using informal personal financing is due to a lack of access to traditional capital. And this is even worse for businesses owned by people of color. Bigger banks, traditionally the main source of financing for small businesses, are making fewer small business loans than they once did, about 50% of pre-recession levels. Without access to small loans or any other source of capital, women and people of color business owners are at a competitive disadvantage. They must rely on personal savings, loans from friends, crowdsourcing, and credit cards when those options are even available. For example, due to differences in their net worth, different racial, ethnic groups tend to find different ways to fund their businesses. So there are studies that show Asian American entrepreneurs rely the most on personal and family savings. About 73.2% of Asian-owned businesses rely on personal and family savings, whereas Black entrepreneurs rely mostly on personal credit cards. It's about 17.6% of the population, while white entrepreneurs rely the most on business loans from banks, and that's 18.7% of those entrepreneurs. But despite this uneven starting point, especially for women-owned business and people of color-owned businesses, the number of small businesses owned by minorities jumped from over, let me see if I'm out of, yeah, I'm a little out of, okay. So this is the right slide that shows the number of women-owned businesses and people of color-owned businesses jumped from just over 6 million people to more than 11 million between 2007 and 2017, which is an increase of 79%, which was about 10 times the overall growth rate for small businesses during this time period. And in the same time frame, the number of women-owned businesses increased by 114%. So studies show that the causes for this include the educational progress of women and people of color, and economic necessity for starting their own businesses. Not surprisingly, women-owned businesses now represent 39% of all American firms. More so, businesses founded by women ultimately deliver more than 2 times the revenue per dollar invested than those founded by men. According to a Boston Consulting Group study, startups founded and co-founded by women are significantly better financial investments. For every dollar of funding, these startups generated 78 cents, while male-founded startups generated less than half that, just 31%. So, makes sense to invest in women-owned businesses, huh? Besides the rapid growth and profitability of people of color-owned and women-owned small businesses, they do not have equal access and opportunities, particularly when it comes to securing financing. According to a survey conducted by Biz2Credit on more than 1,500 minority business owners, 36.3% admitted that lack of adequate funding was their biggest challenge. A couple of reasons for such barriers are that historically, businesses owned by people of color have lower credit scores and lower net worth compared to non-people of color business owners. And these factors have been a barrier for many when applying for financing. So when you think about the black-white wealth gap, that has a big impact on the ability to get credit. Although black people make up nearly 13% of the United States population, they hold less than 3% of the nation's total wealth. The median family wealth for white people is $171,000, whereas for black families, just $17,600. According to another study, among minority businesses expressing a need for credit, over half reported not applying for loans because they feared being denied. And I wonder if some of that fear drove the popcorn ladies from not applying for loans the way they could have. Such fear is well-founded. People of color-owned businesses are approximately 3 times as likely to be denied loans as compared to non-people of color-owned businesses. And furthermore, people of color who are approved for loans tend to receive lower loan amounts and pay higher interest rates than non-people of color. But this is not a problem unique to credit or loans. This extends to other sources such as startup and venture capital. According to the Kauffman Foundation, African Americans, Latinx, and women all began their businesses with less than half of the financial capital of white men, with these differences actually increasing when the businesses matured. Over the past decade, Latinx women-led startups have raised only 0.32%, while Black women have raised only 0.0006%. And while 2017 saw the highest amount of funding raised by companies founded by women of color, they still remain shockingly underfunded compared to others, both in the number that receive investments and the amount of funds that they receive. Just in 2018, the Kauffman Foundation found that less than 2% of startup financing went to women founders, and only 1% went to Black and Latinx founders. Studies indicate that prejudice and racial gender biases create an inefficient allocation of financial resource that only exacerbates inequality and limits the growth of the U.S. economy as a whole. According to a report by the Center for Global Policy Solutions, based on 2007 and 2012 U.S. Census data, the racial gap in business ownership costs the country as much as $300 billion in lost income and as many as 9 million jobs. It's outrageous. Given such barriers for women and people of color owned businesses, in addition to the decline in access to traditional funding, small businesses are increasingly turning to FinTech and online lenders. In 2016, 1 in 5 small businesses reported turning to an online lender for capital, and now is one of the primary sources of funding for small businesses. Online lenders and FinTech companies are changing the game by utilizing innovative technology, new credit models, and alternative data in their loan processes. These innovations could lower the cost of making loans and increase the speed with which businesses receive financing by improving the efficiency of financial intermediation. Most importantly, FinTech may also lead to the diversification of who has access to credit by looking beyond some traditional means of assessing creditworthiness, ultimately making the playing field a bit more even. While FinTech and online lenders have the potential to fill a critical funding gap, they can be predatory when operating in a regulatory void. Many alternative lenders who emerged after the Great Recession are peddling short-term and high-cost products with opaque terms, steep repayment obligations, and high interest rates. One of the main target markets of such lenders are small business owners without traditional sources of funding, which are in most cases either are owned by people of color or businesses owned by people of color or women-owned businesses. According to the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, Black and Latinx-owned firms are twice as likely to apply to online financing compared to white-owned firms. Hence, without proper regulation and oversight, online lenders have considerable leeway in disclosing their products, features, and costs, leading to exploitative lending practices. This brings us to another challenge small businesses face, which are lack of policies that provide the tools and protections that small businesses need. Despite the fact that small businesses in many ways look and behave more like households than Fortune 500 companies, they're generally omitted from regulations that protect financial interests. For example, in the Truth in Lending Act does not apply to or exist for small businesses, due in part to the assumption that small business owners are financially sophisticated or, when lacking necessary expertise, can hire assistance. And there's reason to doubt these assumptions. Behavioral research has uncovered several human biases relevant to financial decision-making. Some of these include the loss aversion, present bias, the status quo bias, the endowment effect, the sunk cost fallacy, and these may prove particularly relevant when it comes to the everyday operation of a small business. Without the proper protection, lenders can use these biases in their favor, leading small businesses to make poor financial decisions. For example, an Opportunity Fund study from 2016 found that nearly half of small business borrowers with online loans were devoting more than 100% of their monthly take-home pay to debt repayment. In the face of these predatory practices from online lenders, there's growing support for Borrower's Bill of Rights, which outlines best practices to protect small businesses from unfair lending practices. And these include increasing transparency around loan terms to allow business owners to make better financial decisions, offering loan products that are repayable and won't trap a business in an expensive cycle of reborrowing, and guaranteeing free, fair, and equal treatment when seeking a loan and in the collections process. At the federal level, Section 1071 of the Dodd-Frank Act, which is currently on hold, requires that the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB, centralize the collection of small business lending data and to make that data public. It also requires new data, including the race and gender of the small business owner, to be reported. The main purpose of this section is to facilitate the enforcement of fair lending laws and enable communities, governmental entities, and creditors to identify business and community development needs and the opportunities of women-owned, minority-owned, and small businesses. Some states are moving forward with policies that protect small businesses. An example is in California, where just this past June, the Department of Business Oversight released a new set of rules to protect the 4 million small businesses in the state from predatory lending practices. And some of these rules include lenders must offer clear disclosure of the annual percentage rate and the estimated monthly payments, and borrowers must be given the opportunity to understand the financing being offered in a clear, concise manner that enables informed comparisons across different options. And I know in Michigan, they're considering legislation to address the payday lending situation in Michigan as well. But in addition to these policies, we also need programs that make accessible tools needed by small businesses to help them achieve their full potential. Such programs should focus on the provision of accessible technical training and collaboration in the entrepreneurial ecosystem. So an example of this is the Detroit Neighborhood Entrepreneurs Project, which is a project of the Center on Finance, Law, and Policy at the University of Michigan, and they're running the project in the Detroit metro area. Detroit businesses get the ability to work with University of Michigan law students, business students, and students in the design school to work on particular aspects of the business that need support. So, for example, the law schools program, which is run through the Community Enterprise Clinic that I run, provides legal advice to small businesses on various issues, including contract issues regarding their entity formation and choice and governance, and intellectual property issues. And all of this is free. The law students provide the legal advice, and they're closely supervised by me and other licensed attorneys to provide this legal advice to the entrepreneurs. And there's a same model in the business school and the design school, so that businesses that need access to accounting and to marketing plans or design plans for their logos have that expertise, which would cost thousands of dollars if they had to get it from people in the private market. So these types of programs, they're so necessary to help these small business owners develop and apply the skills that they need to run the business, and helping the business to become loan ready or investor ready, where additional capital is necessary to meet the company goals. To date, we've had more than 120 small business owners work with our students at the University of Michigan, staff and faculty in some capacity, and over 85% of the businesses have been minority owned, and over 70% have been owned by women. So in conclusion, I just want to reiterate the importance of small businesses for the U.S. economy. For the United States to continue to grow and innovate, and more importantly, to generate jobs, we have to expand our rate of business formation and improve the prospects for survival and the growth of young and small businesses, especially those owned by women and people of color. Expanding business formation may help to contribute to the income and wealth inequality and could help improve social mobility. Increasing the rate of minority and female entrepreneurship may also help to reduce racial and gender wealth gaps. With the U.S. population becoming increasingly diverse, fostering business formation among people of color and women entrepreneurs is critical to improve the rate of entrepreneurship overall and to develop employment opportunities in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you for that great presentation. It's very impressive, as is your background. Can you share whether or not that is offered only for programs and, entrepreneurs and companies in the Detroit area, one, and two, are you aware of others across the country that might be doing the same?
So as of now, the program is offered, it's primarily for Detroit businesses, not even really businesses that are in the Detroit metro area, because we recognize that there's a critical need for Detroit businesses to have access to the resources. And in terms of other programs that are similar at other schools, I'm not aware of other programs. I think this is unique. There are other schools across the country, law schools, for example, that provide legal services to small businesses in disenfranchised areas, and probably other business school programs, but nothing that has this connection with all of the different schools. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very informative. I'm Starr Cunningham. I'm the founder and CEO of 4D Healthware. We're one of the, I'll just say, less than 50 Black women-owned companies. We've raised $4 million in capital.
Wonderful.
0 from venture capital, okay? 0 venture capital. Thank you. And I guess, you know, at this point, we are double-digit growth month over month, revenue, all of these things. And I don't even try anymore. I actually mentioned to my chairman yesterday, I have a better chance of getting struck by lightning 5 times standing in the same place than I do raising venture capital. It's sad, but I don't have conversations anymore, don't want to, don't care to, it's a waste of my time. That being said, is there a way, it just seems like all of the programs, all of the efforts, and I appreciate JB Morgan Chase and Bank of America and all of these initiatives around Black women and venture capital, I appreciate that, but it seems like the effort is very fragmented. It's very challenging for Black women to navigate and figure out how to access the capital for these companies. And now that they've lumped us in with people of color, even though I am a Black woman and I have a challenge with, I can't even be in my bedroom and be safe. So I have a whole set of challenges that other people of color may not have. All right, so that's my foundation. Okay. All of that being said, all of the fragmentation associated with raising capital, is there an opportunity to have a more concerted and consolidated effort somewhere? Because I hear that there are literally millions of dollars being poured into this issue of Black women having access to capital, but I don't see the money. So is there a concerted effort to assist us in having that access to the capital? Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for your question, and congratulations for raising $4 million, or that's really remarkable. That's what we need, right? We need to have either private foundation dollars or some other programming that provides access and knowledge to Black women in particular, but women and people of color to capital. And there isn't really a concentrated program that I'm aware of that provides access to that information. One thing I can say is that there are more and more organizations that I'm hearing about that are specifically focused on providing capital to women and people of color. I don't know if you've heard of Backstage Capital. And you may have applied to that VC firm.
And it can't be only Black people's problem to solve the access to capital issue. So Arlen can't write all the checks for everybody. That's at some point, there are other organizations, like you said, there are family offices, which is where I got the majority of my capital. But it's just very difficult, and it's a very fragmented process, and someone organizing those who have an interest in investing in Black women, because it is so much easier when I enter the room and that person across from me has the ability to write a $500,000 check that they know before I get there that I'm a Black woman. It is so much easier to have the conversation and successfully close the deal.
Right. Agreed.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, my question is kind of along the same lines, but the level of accountability. So we're faced with a number of banking institutions, private institutions that say they are geared toward minority dollars. So I really want to talk about the accountability piece, because I think that we accept the words that we hear in many, many meetings, that this is our focus, this is our city's focus, we want to grow downtown, make sure female Black entrepreneurs have a space, but when we go look for the money, it's not there, as she referred to. So I would really want to talk about how do you then hold their accountability? Do we ask for measurements of what they've done so that we can see that they've actually showed up at the table and done what they said? Can we have more disclosure in what is being asked of us so that we don't have these long meetings, go in and then realize after 20 days of working with them that we're not eligible? Things like that. So more of an accountability piece. And I know that when you talk about forming anything like that, where would we start and how do we start that so that, the yes is truly the yes? Right.
Yeah, and I think that really depends on who we're trying to hold accountable, right? So if we're trying to hold local governments accountable, if they're offering access to capital for people of color-owned businesses, then we have to go to the section of that local government that deals with access to capital, and we've got to either make sure that the city council or the mayor is held accountable, right? Because that department would be under that particular government's watch. So we would have to go to them and make sure they're doing what they need to do. And we also have to be electing people who we think are focusing on these issues, right? If we're not electing people who are in there who can be advocating and fighting for these issues, that's going to be problematic. If we're talking about, philanthropy or private organizations, again, we have to make sure we know who's in the room, and it's challenging because we've got to make sure that there are people there who are focused on the issues and then just advocating to those individuals. So it's a challenging situation, but I think if we are not asking for people who are in these positions of power to be if we're not asking for people who are conscious of these issues to be in these positions of power, then it's going to be really challenging to force the issue.
Thank you for your presentation. My name's
welcome.
Billy Givetti, University of New Mexico. Would you kindly go back to the slide on the sources of funding? I saw you had large banks, small banks, and online lenders.
Is this it?
Like the three.
Was it this one?
No, there's another one. I think whereby the online lenders had grown to become the most was providing. Yeah, predatory lenders. Yes. Yes, there is. A little bit of the history of the online lending as a source of, capital.
Mm-hmm.
How did we get here? When did they begin? Because you look at the, internet, and when it became, an innovation, and soon enough to be adopted to be a source of lending. How did you get here? Just a little bit of the history. And then you highlighted some of the predatory practices that they engage in. I'm keen to know what do they do? What are some of the things that they do to make sure that they go after these people, perhaps viciously?
So with respect to your second question, some of the things that they do is they have extremely high interest rates for the amounts of money that they are giving. And it's very difficult for people to be able to repay the entire amount of funding that they receive. So then they're acquiring more interest on the amounts that they've borrowed. Sometimes people have to borrow even more money to pay off the previous loan that they had. So they get caught in a vicious cycle. In terms of when when more of this online banking started, I don't have a good sense of the history. I just know after the 2008 economic crisis, more and more of these online lenders became prevalent and started to provide these loans to small businesses, but I don't have a good sense of the history.
Hi.
Yes.
My name is Lisa Jones, and I am a private contractor. I don't really know if what I have to say is more a question or a statement, but I spent 30 years working for the government and running million-dollar institutions with 600 staff, okay, that fell under me. Yet when I came to the private sector, one of the very first things I heard was, well, have you thought about making your company nonprofit? Okay, that's, and from the laughs in the room, I can tell that quite a few people have been told that. Have you thought about making it nonprofit? And then when I created the business plan for the organization, because earlier we did hear that one of the things that make our businesses not be as successful is when we start out small. When you go forward with a business plan that starts out with approximately 50 employees, it's like, well, maybe you should think about starting a little bit smaller. So that is something that, those are just two things that I'm kind of finding in the private sector. And so those are, I'm certain that as a Black woman, that challenge is not unique to me.
That people are encouraging you to
Either start smaller or begin a nonprofit.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, I don't think that there are a lot of companies that started small that are extremely successful. I mean, think of Facebook or Snapchat or Instagram or a lot of these smaller internet technology companies. The difference between them and other small businesses is somebody looked at them and their business model, and they were not even their business model, but the founders, and thought, oh, this is something worthy of investing in. And they were people that related to their companies. And if there were more, Black and brown investors that could relate to the businesses that people are creating, then they would more likely have access to capital. So, yeah, I mean, it's really unfortunate to be encouraged to move in the nonprofit sector when you're not going to be able to accumulate wealth. I mean, the definition of a nonprofit is you have to make profit, but you can't distribute that profit to any of the people involved. So that can't be the solution. It's got to be access to more capital and access to more investors of color who can invest in businesses owned by people of color.
Hi, I'm
Yes.
Joanne Celyn from the Asset Funders Network, and you mentioned public policy, and a lot of existing zoning, local laws, state laws, tax policy protects institutions that already exist and and that already have the advantage. But you didn't, and you talked about truth in lending and a few other ideas, but a lot of that is about information, which is still dependent on the business owner doing it. Are there policies where you could upend the system that you would suggest, given that you've really been thinking about this, where state or city, or particularly state or city government, could be really doing something to get behind not only the startup but the expansion of small businesses, particularly those owned by people of color and women?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, it's going to take a shift in our political composition of people who are in Congress and at the presidential level. But I mean, when thinking of particular programs that could be modified to help small businesses, I'm thinking of the new markets tax credits that are currently used to finance businesses and finance projects in cities. And that particular program, it seems to me, could be revamped to be more of a fund that funds promising businesses of color, particularly in urban areas like Detroit or Chicago and other areas, as opposed to having to be linked with a larger development. And perhaps CDBG funds, those are community development block grants funds, which are currently going to cities to fund particular developments. Perhaps that could be transformed into some kind of a venture fund that funds promising small businesses or urban businesses in urban areas. So those are just two things that come to mind that could be re-envisioned, but we just need to have innovative, creative legislators who will push those changes, and then we've got to get a president who would sign off on it. Thank you. Thank you.